April 8, 1943. 27,000 feet above Caen, France, the air was thin enough to kill a man in minutes without pressurization. Inside the cockpit of his Focke-Wulf 190A5, Oberlieutenant Ralf Hermichen allowed himself a smile behind his oxygen mask, a luxury afforded only to those who have already survived 2 years of war in the sky. Through the crystal-clear canopy, he watched them climbing, 16 ungainly silhouettes struggling upward through the frozen stratosphere like drowning men clawing toward a surface they would never reach. The American Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, making their combat debut over occupied Europe, were everything Hermichen had been told to expect. Enormous, cumbersome, grotesquely over-engineered. Die Amerikaner haben uns fliegende Milchflaschen geschickt, he transmitted to his wingman, unable to suppress the laugh crackling through his radio. The Americans have sent us flying milk bottles. Below him, the 16 P-47Cs of the 4th Fighter Group continued their agonizing ascent. Each aircraft weighed over 7 tons fully loaded, nearly twice the mass of Hermichen's Focke-Wulf. Their 2,000 horsepower Pratt Whitney R-2800 double wasp engines roared with brute American excess. But physics is indifferent to horsepower. At this altitude, the Thunderbolts were drowning in their own weight. Hermichen's unit, Jagdgeschwader 26, the Abbeville Kids, had been stationed along the French coast specifically to intercept the American daylight bombing raids. They were the Luftwaffe's elite, hardened by the savage mathematics of the Eastern Front and tempered by the relentless attrition over Britain. They did not lose to novices flying experimental fighters. By every tactical doctrine written in blood over the previous 4 years, this engagement was already decided. The Americans were at least 3,000 feet below optimal combat altitude, their fighters handled like freight trains in a knife fight, and, perhaps most damning of all, the men flying them had never fired their guns in anger. The 4th Fighter Group was composed largely of transferred Eagle Squadron pilots, Americans who had flown Spitfires for the RAF, but the P-47 was not a Spitfire. It was a flying forge, a 7-ton hammer wrapped around an engine that consumed fuel like a house fire. Hermichen checked his airspeed, 380 kilometers per hour. He adjusted his gun sight, a familiar ritual performed hundreds of times. The Focke-Wulf 190 was the most feared fighter in the European theater for a reason. It could outdive, outroll, and out-accelerate nearly anything the Allies fielded. In the hands of someone like Hermichen, a veteran with 16 confirmed kills, it was not a weapon, it was a sentence. He keyed his radio again. Achtung! Angriff! Attack! The German formation rolled inverted and dove. Gravity became an ally. The Focke-Wulfs accelerated past 600 kilometers per hour in seconds, falling like anvils toward the American formation. Hermichen's vision tunneled. His gloved hands worked the stick with unconscious precision, aligning the gun sight's reticle with the lead P-47's massive nose. In the American formation, Captain Don Blakesley, commander of the 4th Fighter Group, did not panic. Panic was a luxury he had exhausted over the skies of Dover, over France, over the gray Channel waters where men drowned in seconds inside burning cockpits. But as the Focke-Wulf screened down toward his formation, something cold and simple moved through his thoughts. We are not ready for this. The P-47 was faster than a Spitfire in level flight. It could outdive anything the Luftwaffe possessed, and mounted in its wings were 8 Browning M2 .50 caliber machine guns, more firepower than any single-engine fighter in history. But none of that mattered if you were caught climbing, out of position, hemorrhaging energy with every second. Blakesley's headset crackled, voices overlapping, fear bleeding through training. Bandits high! Break right! Where the hell did they... The first Focke-Wulf opened fire at 400 yards. Tracer rounds, glowing yellow-white lines of phosphorus, cut through the formation like surgical incisions. A P-47 staggered, its right wing shredding as 20mm cannon shells detonated through aluminum and hydraulic fluid. The pilot, a lieutenant named Hively, 23 years old, married 6 months, fought the controls for 2 seconds before the wing folded completely backward and the Thunderbolt tumbled into a flat spin. He did not eject. The P-47C was not equipped with an ejection seat. Hively rode the aircraft down through 27,000 feet of empty sky, conscious for all of it, until the impact with the French countryside erased him from history in a fireball visible for miles. Hermichen pulled out of his dive, energy bleeding away as he transitioned into a climbing turn. He did not watch the kill. Confirmation could wait. The engagement was chaos now. 16 American fighters scattering like startled birds, his own squadron slashing through them with the disciplined savagery of wolves. This was exactly as it should be. But then the radios began screaming. Not German voices, American. "Stay on them. Push over. Don't climb. Push over." Blakesley had made a decision. Not the decision taught in training manuals, not the decision any rational commander would make when ambushed at disadvantage by a superior enemy. He ordered his pilots to dive. The P-47 Thunderbolt, despite its grotesque weight and its reputation as a flying bathtub, possessed one quality the engineers at Republic Aviation had promised, but no one had truly believed. It could outdive anything in the sky, and it could survive what came next. Hermichen's wingman, Unteroffizier Klaus Mitusch, 19 years old, 6 kills, was completing his attack run when the first Thunderbolt rolled inverted above him and dropped like a guillotine blade. Mitusch saw it coming. He broke left, hard, pulling 6 Gs in a turn that would have torn the wings off a lesser aircraft. The P-47 followed him through the turn. Impossible. The American fighter should have bled speed, should have stalled, should have fallen away. Instead, it closed the distance. Mitusch's radio, "Hilfe, ist," help, he's... 8 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns opened fire simultaneously. 50 caliber rounds, each the size of a man's finger, each weighing nearly 2 ounces, each leaving the barrel at 2,900 feet per second, converged on the Focke-Wulf 190 at a combined rate of 800 rounds per minute. The effect was not cinematic, it was industrial. Mitusch's aircraft disintegrated. Canopy glass exploded, engine cowling shredded, the tail assembly separated cleanly, tumbling away. What remained, a cockpit section trailing smoke and hydraulic fluid and pieces of a 19-year-old boy, fell silently toward the earth. Hermichen heard the transmission cut to static. He rolled his Focke-Wulf hard, eyes scanning for the threat, and saw for the first time what the P-47 truly was. Not a milk bottle, a hammer. The tactical mathematics of aerial combat in 1943 were written in iron law. Altitude equals energy. Energy equals options. Options equal survival. Oberlieutenant Ralf Hermichen had built his 16 kills on these principles. He had flown over Stalingrad, where Soviet pilots threw themselves at German formations with suicidal desperation. He had flown over Britain, where Spitfires turned inside his attacks with balletic precision. He had learned, through blood and mathematics, that airspace belonged to whoever controlled the energy equation. The Americans were rewriting the equation. Hermichen watched a second Focke-Wulf, piloted by Feldwebel Ernst Schroeder, 27 kills, a man who had survived 3 years of continuous combat, attempt to disengage from a pursuing Thunderbolt by diving vertically. Standard doctrine. The Focke-Wulf 19 could reach terminal velocity faster than any Allied fighter. Schroeder should have opened the distance within seconds. The Thunderbolt stayed with him. Not just stayed, closed the gap. At 450 miles per hour, descending through 18,000 feet in a near-vertical dive, the Thunderbolt's nose began spitting tracer fire. Schroeder jinked right, then left, desperate evasive maneuvers that would have shaken any Spitfire, any Hurricane, any P-40. The American pilot, Lieutenant Robert Johnson, 22 years old, flying his fourth combat mission, did not attempt to follow the jinx. He simply pointed his aircraft at where Schroeder would be and held the trigger down. 50 caliber rounds do not negotiate. They do not wound gracefully. At convergence range, the distance where all 8 gun barrels concentrate fire into a single point, the P-47's armament delivered approximately 1,200 foot-pounds of kinetic energy per second. Enough to saw through an aircraft engine block, enough to punch through armor plate designed to stop rifle rounds, enough to turn a Focke-Wulf 19 into wreckage before the pilot understood he was dead. Schroeder's headset was screaming now. "Sie folgen uns in den Sturzflug. They're following us into dives. Wo ist meine Rotte? Where is my wingman? Ich kann nicht. I can't." Static, then silence. For the first time in 2 years, Hermichen felt something he had not permitted himself since the Eastern Front: uncertainty. He pulled into a climbing spiral, gaining altitude, reassessing. 3 of his pilots were gone. Not damaged, not returning to base trailing smoke, gone, erased from the sky in less than 90 seconds by an American fighter that every intelligence briefing had dismissed as too heavy, too slow, too crude for modern air combat. Below him, the Thunderbolts were regrouping. They did not climb back to altitude. They stayed low, 15,000 feet, where their massive Pratt Whitney engines breathed thicker air and produced maximum power. They flew in tight finger-4 formations, a tactic the Luftwaffe itself had invented over Spain. And they waited, not with the hesitant posture of novices, with the cold patience of executioners. Captain Blakesley's voice cut through the radio chatter, calm as a man ordering breakfast. "Hold formation. Conserve ammo. They come to us now." He was right. By the doctrine of aerial combat, Hermichen's formation now held the advantage. They had altitude. They controlled the engagement geometry. They could dive, attack, and climb away before the Thunderbolts could respond. This was the entire strategic foundation of Luftwaffe fighter tactics, energy warfare, executed with Prussian precision. But Hermichen understood what headquarters in Berlin did not. The P-47 had changed the rules. If he dove on them, they would dive with him. And in a dive, the Thunderbolt was not just faster, it was stable. Its massive weight, the same characteristic that made it sluggish in a climb, became an asset in a vertical descent. The aircraft did not shudder, did not buffet. It simply accelerated, straight and true, until its 8 machine guns found range. If he stayed high, he surrendered the initiative. The Americans would escort their bombers home. The mission would fail, and the pilots he had lost, Meaches, Schroeder, and a third whose wreckage was still burning somewhere in the French countryside, would have died for nothing. Hermichen made his choice. Angriff von oben, fast in, fast out. His remaining fighters dove again. This time, the Americans were ready. Lieutenant Johnson saw the Focke-Wulfs coming and did something the Luftwaffe pilots had never encountered from Allied fighters. He turned into the attack, not away, not defensive. He pointed his Thunderbolt's reinforced nose directly at Hermichen's diving formation and opened fire at 800 yards, far beyond effective range for most aircraft. The 50 caliber rounds did not care about effective range. At 800 yards, 50 caliber rounds retained enough velocity to penetrate aluminum skin. At 600 yards, they could destroy engine components. At 400 yards, they could kill pilots through armored glass. Hermichen's windscreen starred with impact fractures as a burst walked across his cowling. He broke left reflexively, abandoning his attack run, survival instinct overriding tactical discipline. Around him, the formation scattered. No coordination, no mutual support. just men trying not to die. One Focke-Wulf, piloted by Lieutenant Hans Gutz, 8 kills, engaged 2 weeks earlier, attempted a vertical climbing roll to evade a pursuing Thunderbolt. The maneuver was perfect, textbook, the kind of aerobatic escape that had saved Gutz's life over the Channel, over France, over Belgium. The P-47 pilot did not follow the roll. He simply pulled his nose up 20 degrees and fired into the space where Gutz would emerge. Predictive deflection shooting, the most difficult gunnery technique in aerial combat, requiring the pilot to calculate his target's future position, lead the shot, and fire into empty air. The Thunderbolt's 8 guns made it simple. The sheer volume of fire, 3,200 rounds per minute combined, meant that even a poorly aimed burst created a cone of destruction 60 feet wide. Gutz's rolled out of his climb directly into that cone. His Focke-Wulf came apart in sections. First, the left wing, sheared off at the root by concentrated 50 caliber fire. Then the engine, which seized and exploded as cannon rounds detonated inside the cylinders. Finally, the cockpit itself, which tumbled through the sky trailing a thin stream of debris, including pieces of Lieutenant Hans Gutz, 24 years old, who had written a letter to his mother that morning describing the French countryside in spring. The letter would be found in his locker 3 days later. It would never be mailed. Hermichen leveled out at 22,000 feet, breathing hard, oxygen mask tight against his face. 4 fighters lost. 4 pilots, men he had flown with, ate with, mourned other dead with, erased in less than 5 minutes of combat. And the Americans were still flying, still hunting. His fuel gauge read 20 minutes remaining. Not enough to continue the engagement, not enough to mount another attack, barely enough to limp back to Abbeville and land with fumes in the tanks. He keyed his radio. Rückzug, alle Flugzeuge Rückzug. Retreat, all aircraft retreat. The remaining Focke-Wulfs turned east, climbing hard, using the last of their energy to open distance from the Thunderbolts. The Americans did not pursue. They had strict orders, stay with the bombers. The Army 4th Fighter Group's mission was not to rack up kills. It was to ensure the B-17s reached their targets and returned home. Glory was secondary to mathematics. But as Hermichen's formation disappeared into the haze over occupied France, Captain Blakesley allowed himself a single transmission. Good shooting, gentlemen. Count your rounds. The pilots checked their ammunition counters. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, 1,850 rounds remaining out of 3,400. Lieutenant Gerald Johnson, 2,100 rounds remaining. The others, similar numbers. They had not even expended half their combat load, and they had shattered a veteran Luftwaffe formation. Hermichen landed at Abbeville 17 minutes later, his Focke-Wulf streaming fuel vapor, his hands shaking inside his gloves. The ground crew rushed to his aircraft, expecting battle damage. There was none. He had not been hit. He had simply been beaten. In the operations tent, Hermichen filed his after-action report with numb precision. 4 aircraft lost. Cause, enemy action. Enemy type, Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. Tactical assessment, underestimated. That final word, underestimated, would appear in Luftwaffe intelligence reports with increasing frequency over the following months. But on April 8, 1943, it was just a word written by a man who laughed at flying milk bottles and watched them kill his friends.
June 1943. 2 months after the engagement over Caen, France, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was no longer a curiosity. It was a plague. Luftwaffe intelligence officers in Berlin pored over reports with mounting horror. The pattern was undeniable. Wherever the P-47 appeared, over France, over Belgium, over the Netherlands, German fighter losses spiked. Not gradually, not proportionally, exponentially. By mid-May, the kill-to-loss ratio for Focke-Wulf 190 units engaging Thunderbolts had inverted. For every P-47 shot down, the Americans were claiming 3 German fighters, sometimes 4. The mathematics were unsustainable. And the Americans were just beginning. Oberlieutenant Ralf Hermichen survived April 8th. He survived May. He survived the first 2 weeks of June, logging 43 more combat missions against American daylight raids. His kill count remained frozen at 16. Not because he lacked skill, not because he had lost his nerve, because the Thunderbolts would not die. He had put rounds into them, watched tracer fire walk across wings, fuselages, engine cowlings. The P-47s absorbed damage that would have downed any Messerschmitt, any Focke-Wulf. Their radial engines could lose entire cylinders and continue running. Their airframes were reinforced with structural redundancy that bordered on obsessive. They had self-sealing fuel tanks, armor plate behind the pilot's seat, and a cockpit design that prioritized survival over weight. The Americans had built a fighter that refused to acknowledge when it was dead. Worse, they had learned how to use it. The early engagements, Kong, and the scattered skirmishes that followed had been clumsy. American pilots, fresh from training, had treated the P-47 like an oversized Spitfire. They had tried to turn fight, to climb fight, to engage in the swirling dogfights that characterized air combat over Britain. They lost. But the Americans possessed something the Luftwaffe did not: industrial capacity for error. When a German pilot died, he took years of training and irreplaceable experience with him. When an American pilot died, 10 more graduated from flight schools in Texas, in Arizona, in California. They could afford to learn. They could afford to adapt. By June, they had adapted. The new American doctrine was brutally simple: speed and firepower. Do not turn with the enemy. Do not climb with the enemy. Use the P-47's strengths, high-speed dive performance, devastating armament, and structural invincibility to dictate engagement terms. Dive on the enemy. Fire. Extend away in a shallow dive using superior speed to open distance. Climb back to altitude outside enemy range. Repeat. The Luftwaffe called it Yankee tactics. The Americans called it boom and zoom. Hermichen called it a death sentence. On June 22, 1943, he flew what would be his final mission. The target was a formation of B-17 flying fortresses returning from a raid on synthetic fuel plants in the Ruhr Valley. 56 heavy bombers escorted by 32 P-47 Thunderbolts from the 56th Fighter Group. Standard assignment. Hermichen's squadron, reduced now to 9 operational aircraft, was tasked with intercepting the bomber stream before it reached Allied airspace. They climbed to 28,000 feet and waited. The bombers appeared first, strung out across the sky in defensive boxes, their sub-caliber turrets scanning for threats. Hermichen ignored them. The B-17s were dangerous, flying porcupines bristling with machine guns, but they were predictable, slow, committed to their flight path. The Thunderbolts were different. They flew above the bombers, stepped up in altitude, positioned like executioners waiting for the condemned to make their final mistake. Hermichen counted them: 32. His formation: 9. The mathematics were clear. He keyed his radio anyway. On Griff. His Focke-Wulf rolled inverted and dove toward the bomber formation, reaching 450 miles per hour in seconds. He selected a B-17 on the formation's edge, tail number 230123, piloted by Lieutenant Charles Morrison, 23 years old, 7th mission, and aligned his sights view. 400 yards, 300 yards, 200 yards. He pressed the trigger. His 20-millimeter cannons roared, shells tracking toward the bomber's wing route. The Thunderbolts fell on him like hammers. 3 P-47s diving from above, converging on Hermichen's aircraft from angles that made evasion geometrically impossible. He broke left, hard, pulling 8 Gs, vision graying at the edges from blood draining away from his brain. Tracer fire followed him through the turn. Not random spray, coordinated fire.
The American pilots were communicating, bracketing his escape routes, forcing him into a shrinking box of sky where every direction led to 50 caliber rounds. Hermichen's instruments shattered as a burst walked across his cockpit. Glass fragments sliced his right cheek. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the canopy, obscuring his vision. His engine coughed once, twice, then seized completely as cannon fire destroyed the cylinder heads. Silence. At 26,000 feet, with no engine and no options, Oberlieutenant Ralf Hermichen became a glider pilot. Below him, the battle continued. His remaining fighters scattered, each man alone in the sky, pursued by American aircraft that would not relent and could not be outrun. He watched 2 more Focke-Wulf disintegrate under concentrated fire, watched another attempt to bail out, only to have his parachute shredded by a P-47's guns, a war crime by any standard, though no one would be prosecuted. Hermichen's altitude, 18,000 feet, 15,000 feet, 12,000 feet. His aircraft was descending at 3,000 feet per minute, an unpowered brick falling toward occupied France. He could bail out. The parachute was functional. He might survive the landing, might evade capture, might make it back to German lines. Or he could stay with the aircraft. Write it down. Join Methus, Schroeder, Goetz, and all the others whose names were already fading from memory. At 8,000 feet, he made his choice. Hermichen popped the canopy. Wind screamed into the cockpit, tearing at his flight suit, ripping the oxygen mask from his face. He unbuckled his harness, stood against the slipstream, and jumped. The parachute deployed at 6,000 feet, white silk blossoming against gray sky. He descended in silence, watching the battle above him continue without his participation. More black smoke trails, more aircraft tumbling earthward. The arithmetic of aerial combat, rendered in burning aluminum and men who would never grow old. German military police found him 40 minutes later, sitting in the field, parachute still attached, staring at the sky. They asked him if he was injured. He did not answer. September 1943. The United States Army Air Forces had deployed 1,200 P-47 Thunderbolts to the European theater. By December, that number would reach 2,500. By March 1944, 4,000. The Luftwaffe's fighter arm, once the most feared air force in the world, was bleeding to death. Not from lack of courage, not from inferior aircraft, from mathematics. For every P-47 lost, American factories built 20 more. For every pilot killed, 20 more graduated from flight schools in Texas, in Arizona, in California. They could afford to learn. They could afford to adapt. More than that, the P-47 had become something unexpected, a symbol. To American pilots, it represented survival, the aircraft that could take punishment no other fighter could absorb and bring its pilot home. Stories circulated, Thunderbolts landing with 3 feet of wing missing, with engines shot to pieces and cockpits shredded by cannon fire and pilots bleeding but alive. To German pilots, it represented inevitability. The realization that skill, experience, and tactical brilliance were no longer sufficient. That the war had moved beyond individual heroism into the realm of industrial attrition. That they were not fighting pilots anymore. They were fighting production capacity. Ralf Hermichen never flew combat again. He was reassigned to a training unit in Bavaria where he taught young pilots, boys really, 16 and 17 years old, how to survive encounters with American fighters. He told them about the P-47, about its speed, its firepower, its refusal to die. He did not tell them that survival was becoming statistically impossible. By the end of 1943, the average German fighter pilot's life expectancy in combat was 17 missions. Many did not reach 10. The P-47 had not won the air war alone, but it had broken the myth of German invincibility in the sky. It had proven that American engineering, crude, excessive, built with redundancy that violated every European design principle, could match and exceed the refined precision of German aeronautics. Not through elegance, through